Hello and welcome to Craftiosity, where creativity comes to you with monthly craft kits delivered to your door. This month we're exploring the art of weaving, using your own mini loom and combining the warp thread and the weft yarns to create a set of antique pink and sand coloured coasters. Inside your kit you'll find your printed templates, your cotton yarns, a needle and your warp thread, and your weaving loom. You'll also find your step-by-step photo instructions and a little something for your pinboard. Start by tying a slip knot in one end of your warp thread. Make a circle with the short tail end underneath and the long piece on top. Then bring the long piece under the circle and pull it up through the circle to create a loop. Hold the loop and pull the short and long ends to tighten. Place the loop over the fourth peg from the left on the bottom of your loom and tighten the knot up. Take the warp thread straight up and around the fourth peg from the left on the top of your loom, and then back down and around the fifth peg on the bottom of the loom. Now you'll go up and around the fifth peg from the left at the top, and then down and around the sixth peg on the bottom. Keep your warp thread pulled tight as you go up and down. Repeat this process along your loom until you have 25 warp threads. You should end on the top peg, fourth from the right. This will be your last peg, so instead of going around it, you'll tie another slip knot in your thread and place this over the peg, tightening it so it's secure. Trim off the excess warp thread, leaving a short tail. Cut a strip of card roughly 5 cm high and slightly wider than your warp threads. Weave this piece of card under and over each of your warp threads and position it so it sits at the bottom of your loom, like this. Choose which of the designs you'd like to begin weaving and cut out the template. If it's your first time weaving, it might be simpler to start with a striped coaster, as this will be the easiest to learn. We'll show you the steps for one of the more involved designs. Your coaster will be the same height as the template but slightly narrower. Take your first colour of yarn and cut a piece around 1.5 meters long. Don't cut your yarn too long, as you'll find it keeps getting tangled as you weave. Thread the yarn through your plastic needle and double it over except for the last 30 centimetres. You'll adjust this as you go, it's just to make sure it's not too long as you start weaving. To weave your first row, begin a few threads in from the side of your loom. This is so you don't have all your yarn tails right on the edge of your weaving. Bring your needle between the third and fourth warp threads from the right hand side of the loom, bringing the needle from the back of the loom to the front, leaving the tail of yarn at the back. Weave your needle under and over the warp threads, making sure you alternate each time so your yarn goes over, under, until you reach the other side. Gently pull your yarn through, but be careful not to pull the tail out. Then push your row of weaving down so it sits on top of the strip of card. Now you'll weave your second row working back across your loom, but you'll be doing the opposite pattern of over, under to your previous row. So if you went under a warp thread on your first row, this time you'll go over it. One of the tricks to keep your weave looking neat is to make sure you don't pull too hard on the yarn as you're weaving. You'll notice if you do, as it will pull the first warp thread inwards so it no longer sits straight. The yarn should just wrap around the end warp thread without being too loose or too tight. To help prevent this, weave at an upward angle towards the middle of your loom, then a downward angle back to the other side of your loom to create a little hill with your weave. Then tap this down as normal. Repeat this under and over weaving technique, making sure to push each row down once it's completed to create a nice even weave. Weave as many rows as needed to fill the section that you're working on using your template. Place the template under the weaving to check the pattern and make sure your stripe is thick enough before moving on to the next one. You don't need to keep the template there, just use it to check in as you go along. Follow the pattern to weave a stripe in yarn A, a stripe in yarn B, and another stripe in yarn A, etc. To change to a new piece of yarn or a new colour, weave over and under a few threads so you're not finishing on the edge of your weaving. Finish on an over and bring the needle and yarn to the back of your weaving. Cut a new piece of yarn and thread your needle. Bring the needle up from the back of your weaving, one warp thread away from where you ended your previous piece of yarn. There should be one empty warp thread between them. Begin with weaving over the first thread, then under the second, continuing the pattern you would have been weaving if you hadn't changed your thread. You'll tidy the yarn tails at the very end. When weaving geometric shapes like the triangles and diamond shapes, you won't weave every one of your warp threads. To make your shape narrower, you can skip one warp thread on each side, and to make it wider, you can include one more warp thread on each side. To start weaving your triangle, work 3 rows using all of your warp yarns in yarn B. Now weave a 4th row, but when you get to the end of the 4th row, don't go around the last warp thread, go around the second to last warp thread. Then weave back across your loom to create your 5th row, but again don't go around the last warp thread on this side, go around the second to last one. You've now completed a decrease. Weave 2 more rows that are the same width as your 4th and 5th rows. Repeat these steps again. This time you'll be skipping 2 warp threads and ending on the 3rd from the end on each side of your loom. From now on, each time weave 3 rows before decreasing on either side. Keep placing your template under your weaving to make sure that the angle of your triangle is correct. If the sides are too steep, you can weave fewer rows before decreasing. Your triangle should end with 1 warp thread in the middle. Wrap your yarn around this middle thread 3 times. Then begin the same process but in reverse to create the second upside down triangle. Now instead of skipping 1 warp thread on either side, you'll be adding back in 1 on each side. So you'll weave around 3 threads for your first 3 rows, then increase to 5 threads for 3 rows. Continue weaving with increasing rows until you've completed your second triangle. Now you can fill in the empty spaces between your 2 triangles using yarn A. Start from the bottom of your first triangle, wrapping yarn A around the empty warp thread twice. You're replicating the process for weaving the triangle but in reverse as you're starting with the point of the triangle. There's 2 ways to fill in the weave space. The first is a little easier. Weave up to and then around the last empty warp thread. This will leave a very small gap between the 2 different coloured sections of weaving, but your weaving is still completely secure. Weave following the same row pattern as you did to create your triangle, so you have the same number of rows in yarn A as you do in yarn B. The second way is the interlocking method. Weave up to the triangle section as normal, and then place your needle up and under the loop of yarn B that wraps around the last warp thread. So the yarn you're weaving with will be looped through yarn B. Then weave back along the row as normal. Repeat this process for each row, matching the number of rows woven in yarn B. To make your tassels, cut lengths of yarn roughly 8 to 10 centimeters long. The easiest way to cut multiple pieces at once is to wrap yarn around something the same height as you want your yarn to be, like a piece of cardboard. Then cut through the end of the wrapped yarn to give you lots of pieces the same length. Find your first pair of warp threads. Take 3 strands of your cut yarn and feed one end down either side of your first pair of warp threads and pull down. Turn over your loom and match up the ends of your yarn so they're even. Then bring all 6 ends of yarn up in between the pair of warp threads so they're now on the front of your loom again. This is a raya knot. Your raya knot will be a little loose until you tie off your warp threads, so lay your tassels back against the weaving so it doesn't undo itself. Repeat with each pair of warp threads until you get to the end where you have 3 final warp threads. Bring your yarn up either side of the middle thread. Starting at the top of your loom, lift one of your warp threads off the peg and cut it in half where it folds over. Take the 2 halves of the warp thread and tie together in a double knot, tightening up so it sits close to your raya knot. Don't tighten your knot so much that it pushes your rows of weaving out of place. Repeat this process with each of your warp threads. You'll end with 3 threads, which you'll tie together into one knot. Have 1 thread in one hand and 2 threads in the other and tie as though a normal knot. Then repeat the process with your bottom row of warp threads. Turn your coaster over and trim the ends of the warp thread knots, keeping them nice and short so they're hidden behind your tassels. You can also trim your tassels at this point. Cut off a small amount if you just want to neaten the edges, or you can cut off more to create shorter tassels. To tidy your yarn tails, turn over your coaster and thread 1 yarn tail onto your needle. Slide the needle under your weaving at the back of your coaster. It should slide easily under a tunnel created by your weaving. Cut off the rest of the yarn tail, being careful not to cut your actual weaving. Repeat for each tail until they are neatly hidden underneath your weaving. And well done, your coaster is complete. You've enough yarn to make 4 coasters, so enjoy choosing your next pattern to make. Thanks so much again for watching. We hope you enjoyed this tutorial and we look forward to welcoming you to the next craft kit project next month.